Hello, this is Wayne Ferreira, and I'm going to be talking you through the AQA Psychology A-Level Attachment Topic Paper 1, specifically looking at cultural variations, which ends up being quite a challenging topic for students to have a look at. The specification says cultural variations in attachment, including Van Isseldoorn, and that's all the guidance that they give us. And so we're going to focus most of what we look at the Van Isseldoorn study. This comes directly after having looked at the different attachment types and specifically understanding kind of how the strange situation was used to find those attachment types. Before we start, we can have a look at a basic kind of understanding of culture, talking about the norms and values that exist within a particular group. And what we're going to specifically try and have a look at is to see whether the cultural child rearing practices will impact kind of how the attachment type looks at. And we see that Van Isseldoorn looks at how these practices impact the proportion of attachment in these particular countries. Before we kind of move on, we need to understand that if we see that what Bowlby said about attachment being innate and adaptive, then this would be the optimal strategy to be securely attached. And of course, what we're trying to do is to establish whether secure attachment is found all across the world in different places where child rearing practices may impact that type of attachment. I would recommend highly the Babies DVD. That is about 60 minutes long. We see the lives of 4 children across 4 different parts of the world. What I will kind of say is that actually there's quite a lot of similarity. I quite like the intimacy that you find between the parenting styles of the girl in Africa, Namibia specifically, and in America. However, you do see a difference in terms of the role of the father there. We also can expect kind of certain changes. In contrast, for example, if you grow up in Japan, high technology, high-rise buildings, it may well be quite significantly different to being raised in outer Mongolia. That's a baby's DVD that can be found in most kind of DVD stores. Now, looking specifically at Van Isseldoorn, I focus on the 1988 publication that Van Isseldoorn did with Cronenberg. And as I said, he's looking specifically, or they are looking specifically, at the proportions of attachments across these different countries. It was a meta-analysis, so that means it's a study of studies, where we know that they were able to find 32 studies that had used the strange situation to determine the attachment type, and that these studies were found to be across 8 different countries, where we know that 15 of them were in the US, and the rest were across these different countries. This is quite significant because obviously being able to study a large amount of data around nearly 2,000 children could actually give us some kind of understanding or impact on kind of what the attachment types are. Looking specifically at a diagram of the findings, what we have are the 8 different countries kind of along the bottom here, and then we see kind of the attachment types that we have, and it's a very nice kind of graph that's taken from the Illuminate digital publication book, and we see that quite clearly secure attachment is significantly larger than any of the other attachment types. We see orange, the insecure avoidant, is also quite significantly kind of higher than the red, insecure resistant, and I've highlighted the Takahashi in terms of Japanese study and the Grossman in Germany because I will make reference to it later. Now, as I said, there was a wide variation in the proportions of attachment types in these different studies. You can see from the diagram how that kind of looks like, but we do see, as I said, that secure attachment was the most common, but it's not exactly the same percentage we find between the different countries. We see, for example, 75% for Great Britain and 50% for China. Following this, as I said, the insecure avoidant was the next most common, but there are a few exceptions. We see here Israel and Japan are significantly different in terms of this. Now, this could be related to individualistic versus collectivist cultures, and so Van Isseldoorn does kind of make some kind of reference to this, and we see here that insecure resistant was similar in the individualistic countries that Ainsworth original study was done. So, for example, in the USA, in Great Britain, and places that were considered to be individualistic, we see that insecure resistant all fall under 14%. But in collectivist cultures like China, Japan, and Israel, we see that the insecure resistance are much higher. And this could be related to how the different kind of individualistic versus collectivist natures do kind of raise children and have expectations placed upon the child rearing practices. Now, we also find that there is great variation between results within the same country. So, for example, there is this 150% difference between studies in the US, where we have one study only having 46% securely attached children compared to another one that had 90%. So therefore, this may be something that we can look at in terms of the evaluation, in terms of the criticism of this particular study. Now, because the specification does focus on Van Isseldoorn, it is important that you do write any particular answer, that you include Van Isseldoorn in detail. However, when we look at the essay questions, they do talk about research or studies into culture variations, and so therefore there's other research that we can have a look at. And what I've included is the Simonelli research from 2014 because it is a bit more recent than the Van Isseldoorn study. And what we see here is that there is some interesting pieces of information. Okay, so it says here, an increasing number of mothers of young children who work long hours. And that is something which is more specific to later life. And what they were able to look at is the insecure avoidant specific type of attachment, and they were able to assess 76 babies and found that 50% were secure and 36% were insecure avoidant. So there's a decrease in secure attachment and an increase in this insecure avoidant attachment type. Okay, now this is a shift, obviously, in how those secure and insecure resistant types kind of are reflected within the culture. And we see that actually maybe what we need to recognize that Van Isseldoorn kind of research is not static, and so therefore countries and cultures may change in terms of their attachment type over time. There's also a study by Jin in 2012, also more recent study, this time looking at 87 babies using the strange situation, and we find that actually it says secure babies were similar in most countries. So what we're having here is that there's quite clearly a link to this idea that maybe secure attachment is found across cultures. But what we find is that the biggest shift or change in these countries is the difference between the insecure attachment types. So, for example, if there was kind of looking at studies where there are more resistant to children than avoidant children, and what we see here is that maybe the child rearing practices between Japan and Korea may actually be what is reflected in having resistant children rather than having insecure avoidant children. And I'll make hopefully that will be clearer when we look specifically at the Takahashi study in a moment. Okay, so what we can conclude about cultural variations into attachment, it says that most attachment appears to be similar to the US, okay, in that secure attachment is the most common. So therefore we could argue that secure attachment or attachment is universal. Okay, and as such it is possibly clear that Bowlby's research that talks about how attachment types are important, that maybe having a secure attachment is optimal. Okay, but it could be that cultural practices do influence whether their attachment type kind of changes over time. So what we have here is taken from the Illuminate textbook once again, it's the lifeline, it's the basic ideas where you have on the left the concept that you perhaps need to remember, and on the right, kind of one or two sentences to explain it. And so what we see here is that if you were trying to focus on the knowledge aspect of this particular topic, you should look at Van Ezeldorn and Cronenberg, you should look at Simonelli and possibly Gin as well. Now, I've mentioned two other studies. One of them was Grossman and Grossman, and the other one is Takahashi. Now, the reason that you may have used this is because if we look at either the strange situation or we look at Bowlby, we can use this as evaluation points there as well. And we see that the culture may influence what the attachment looks like. And so Grossman felt that German culture includes respect for personal space. And as such, when they were evaluated using the strange situation, they found a significantly higher amount of insecure, avoidant children. In contrast, Takahashi, who replicated Ainsworth's research exactly in Japan, found a higher rate of insecure, resistant children, you see here, of 32%. But of course, what we can attribute this to is how we raise children. For example, we see in Japan that the children very rarely leave their mothers, and so therefore in the particular aspect of the strange situation where they're left alone, Takahashi had to stop many of those strange situation kind of stages because the children were extremely upset, which is one of the signs of insecure, resistant children. So it's worth bearing in mind these two studies because they could be used in your essay as the research. They could be examples of how child rearing practices do influence the attachment type, or we could just kind of use them as a contrast when we're looking at some of the evaluation points. Now, I've just said these studies demonstrate cross-cultural differences. So moving on to the evaluation of this particular topic. Now, it's really important that we look at the structure of how we write particular essays. If we look at a level 3 and level 4, they look for this idea that evaluation is mostly effective. And so therefore, I've tried to use a structure that includes kind of this argument that we're having a look at. And so what I've started with is a strength of reason because it was a meta-analysis, and so therefore we can have a look at what that means. So a lot of people felt that when Takahashi and people like Grossman and Grossman studied the children in their own countries. They were indigenous, in other words, they were from that particular part of the world, that they truly had a good understanding of how to treat the particular children. So what we say here is a strength of this is it avoids potential problems in cross-cultural research because any misunderstandings of language or kind of how people are treated may actually not have occurred. And so, of course, we say that this means that there's not cultural bias and therefore it makes it more valid. So that's quite a good strength. But in terms of countering this, we know that not all the studies that look at cross-cultural research is done by indigenous psychologists. And a very famous psychologist, Tronick, kind of did some work in Zaire with the FA trial, looking at kind of how to use or how to understand kind of attachment in that particular place. Now here is an example of that video, and we see that they use the strange situation, but they have a few kind of changes to how that works. So as we see there, that not all research were done by indigenous psychologists, and so therefore we have to potentially argue as a counter argument to this idea that there was a strength that there could have been some kind of bias, and certainly some kind of communication issues when these studies occurred, and certainly how they've interpreted the strange situation in that particular video clip may also impact kind of our understanding of cultural variations. And so therefore it's important for us to look at this as a methodological issue, but of course it's our understanding of cultural variations that become quite important to us. Now, I've added to this particular point is that we know that these particular studies that were used in the meta-analysis all use the strange situation, but they do not have the same variables or environment. Okay, and so that is quite important. We saw in that particular clip that they were preparing food in the original Ainsworth strange situation. They had toys to play with in a comfortable environment. And so what we have to also accept is that because they weren't done by the same researcher who was trying to eliminate the same variables, there could be something called confounding variables. And so, of course, the outcome of the study could actually have changed because of how the particular variables impacted kind of how the participants kind of behaved. And so, therefore, we do find that this is a problem. Okay, so it says that the attachment behavior could be different. Okay, so therefore it may be that even though they all use the strange situation, the Van Isseldoorn study may not tell us anything specifically about cultural patterns because of these confounding variables. Now, moving on, what we do find is that there are other limitations to cross-cultural research. Okay, and the biggest kind of issue that we will have with Van Isseldoorn and many of the strange situations studies is this idea of imposed ethic. Okay, now of course in year two when you do the issues and debates topic, this will be a little bit clearer to you. But in a very basic level, it's this idea that if I take what I understand into another culture or context, then therefore I could actually impose what I think is what is right and wrong into how they do things. And so therefore we can argue that what we're looking for is my understanding of attachment. And so in order to highlight this, what we can argue is that the strange situation, this was the tool that was used to measure attachment, was designed by an American researcher, Ainsworth, who had worked with Bowlby, a British researcher. So therefore, it is possible that applying this technique, okay, taking one type of idea and imposing it on another culture is problematic. Okay, so for example, Bowlby was, and this was also backed up by other British researchers, would have looked at separation anxiety as being one of the issues or one of the ways in which we can determine whether somebody is securely attached. And so if somebody has a lack of pleasure in reunion, for example, that could indicate insecure attachment, or lack of anxiety if the mother leaves could be an example of not being securely attached. Therefore, it is possible that what we've done here is that we've imposed our understanding of attachment onto these other cultures. And this is highlighted by the Grossman and Grossman German study, because the idea of independent behavior may actually be seen differently between Germany and Britain, for example. So what we then need to take our argument back to is we can't just mention these ideas without actually arguing why is this important. And of course this last statement here says that if you use strange situation, it may not have the same meaning. Okay, and so therefore what that means that trying to understand culture without context means that it's our understanding of that culture is meaningless. Now, this could also be confounded by the fact that Van Isseldoorn and and Cronenberg were just looking at the strange situation, but they weren't necessarily considering kind of differences within the single culture itself. And what we see later is that Van Isseldoorn does some work with Sagi and finds that if you compare rural and urban settings, that there is actually some interesting outcomes. For example, we see the attachment types in Tokyo, which is considered to be urban, actually being very similar to kind of other kind of places such as the United States and Britain. And it's the contrast to the rural settings where there's an overrepresentation of insecure resistant types. Okay, so possibly what we have here is that when we start looking at different countries, it doesn't actually give us a clear picture of cultural variations, because within the same country there may be kind of big differences. Okay, so in terms of trying to then bring this back to the A-level psychology, what we can look at is a few questions. What we do have is this multiple choice question. This is actually quite an old question, but it's definitely worth kind of having a look at. All you need to have a look at is this idea of it saying which one of the following countries was found to have the highest percentage of anxious avoidant children. So that's anxious as an old term, so it would be insecure avoidant children. And we see actually, if it's avoidant, it must be Germany. Okay, these are two kind of questions that are very similar, but we see in one of them only being 6 marks. It just simply says outline. But the reason I put them together is because of this idea of studies or the idea of research. And students do tend to panic about this. Okay, so the first one is pure knowledge. All that we are doing is just simply write information or context or trying to explain what studies have shown us about cultural variations. So we can look at the Van Isseldoorn and Cronenberg. We may want to include maybe a few of the kind of other studies, the Yun or the Simonelli study, but we don't need much more than kind of one main study in terms of Van Isseldoorn, possibly a mention of another. That's also a reason why I've included the Takahashi and the Grossman and Grossman, because you might want to kind of consider using that in a short question, 6-mark knowledge one. In contrast, the other question has this word and evaluation. So therefore, we're going to have to kind of break our ratio between knowledge and evaluation to include kind of a bit more evaluation points. Okay. Now, once again, research is the same as that word studies above. We're looking at Van Isseldoorn. We're looking at perhaps using kind of one or two more other studies to also indicate kind of what those cultural variations are. And so therefore, the outline part of this particular essay will pretty much resemble the 6-mark knowledge question that we have here. But when we come to evaluation, we need to consider this idea of effective. So therefore, we're looking at kind of a structured argument. And that is, of course, the Peake paragraphs or Peter paragraphs or Peel paragraphs that you would have looked at before. Now, the last slide is just this specific question from 2017. We see that they do like this question on cultural variations. This time it's a short essay, only 8 marks, but we see that the word says discuss findings. So therefore, discuss has elements of both kind of outline and also has elements of evaluation. But we see that they want us to focus on findings. So for this particular one, I'll just simply use the Van Isseldoorn and Cronenberg study because there's enough findings there for me to write about it. I hope you have enjoyed this and this has explained things to you in a clear way. Thank you for listening, and I'll hopefully post this as soon as I can.